Today, we see people leaving countries that are the places where they were born and have lived because there's a threat of violence so great that they can't stay. It's just not rational to stay. That's what happened in America.
From 1882 to 1910, more than 3,700 lynchings concentrated in the South occurred across the United States. Around 2/3 of lynching victims were Black, and the white people lynched were often those who helped Black victims or fought against lynching. African Americans were also restricted politically and economically, with literacy tests that could determine enfranchisement and a system called sharecropping that replaced the plantation system with a new system of bondage, tying poor Black farmers to the lands of whites. Such intense racial oppression and violence in the South initiated the Great Migration of African Americans to northern and western cities. The violence established the need for a new frontier, but as African Americans arrived in cities like Chicago, it was evident that escaping the South did not necessarily mean escaping the oppression that it embodied. The new frontier established Chicago as a hotspot for racial violence, ultimately sending on its long journey towards healing and justice. Between 1910 and 1970, around 6 million Black Americans migrated towards northern and western cities from the South. The majority of Chicago-bound migrants came from Mississippi, which had been a center of the violence that festered in the Jim Crow South. But as it turned out, it was not as easy as the masses had hoped to escape such cruelty. Instead, the mistreatment followed them like ghosts to Chicago, which they had hoped to have been able to call home. By the end of the 20th century, these migrants made up a third of the city's residents. Soon, there were more Black folks living in Chicago than in the entire state of Mississippi. At that time, many migrants did not put a label on the course of their lives. However, those millions of people and what they did would seep into nearly every realm of American life and culture. Before World War I, factories in the North had been relying greatly on European immigrants for their labor force. But when World War I began, these immigrants stopped arriving. Many men in the North also left their jobs to fight in the war. The shortage of labor ultimately opened the door for a wave of Southern African American migrants to come fill these jobs. They quickly emerged as a cheap workforce that would often act as strikebreakers, making the social complaints of European immigrants futile. The extensive social and economic tensions in Chicago set the stage for the event that would ultimately trigger its Red Summer. On July 27, 1919, thousands took to the shores of Lake Michigan seeking relief from the blazing heat of the Chicago summer sun. The beaches were segregated not by law, but simply by custom that was enforced by white people and police alike. Meanwhile, 5 Black teenagers were enjoying the water on a raft when they accidentally floated over this invisible line of segregation. A white man on the shore, George Stauber, began throwing rocks at the boys. One of the teens, Eugene Williams, was hit in the head with the rock and drowned. In no time, nearly 1,000 Black Chicagoans had assembled at the 29th Street beach to demand the arrest of Stauber for murder. But Daniel Callahan, the white police officer on duty, refused to arrest Stauber. Following the crowd's arrivals to the 29th Street beach, a Black man named James Crawford opened fire on a group of police officers, who immediately shot and killed him. The crowd, however, did not disperse. By nightfall, rumors of race war in white neighborhoods were running rampant. Soon, the violence that started on the shores of Lake Michigan had spread through the residential areas of Chicago's Black Belt. Within 24 hours, groups of young white men climbed into cars and raced through major streets, shooting at homes and businesses, while others marched up 35th Street with guns, sticks, and rocks, assaulting any Black person to cross their path. When the riots began, Juanita Mitchell had just come to Chicago with her family. Even at 107 years old, Mitchell recalled the terror of her 8-year-old self.
I can hear my uncle saying, "Here they come." And when he said, "Here they come," it meant the white folks were coming.
After rumors had spread by word of mouth, they began to spread also through sensationalized newspaper accounts. Even the highly regarded Chicago Daily News sacrificed facts for headlines that would attract attention and business. In addition to this over-dramatization by newspapers, the lack of legal aid from police demonstrated by the murder of Eugene Williams continued throughout the riots that followed. During the first few hours of the violence, 2,800 officers out of 3,500 total were deployed along the edges of the Black Belt, forming a cordon. The police claimed that they were separating the antagonists, but their strategy left few officers to patrol the rest of the city. The officers proved that they were more committed to keeping black folks in than keeping white assailants out, as the Black Belt became the center of crime and violence in Chicago. In the end, only 47 people were indicted for the racial violence that they committed, and although they made up 2/3 of the over 500 recorded casualties, blacks were indicted at double the rate of whites. The president of the time, Woodrow Wilson, also seemed to brush the widespread race riots under the rug, arguing that to stop them was a job for local authorities only. Finally, after a week of no response from both the federal and state governments, the state militia, partnered with a heavy rainstorm in Chicago, put an end to the riots on August 3rd. At this point, nearly 1,000 black homes had been burned, $250,000 worth of property had been destroyed, 500 people, mostly black, had been injured, and 38 people, 23 of whom were black, had been killed. The coroner's report on the riot described the events as having filled thousands with fear, blemished the city, and left in its wake fear and apprehension for the future. Blacks in turn responded with force, making a clear statement that African Americans would no longer be passive victims. Since then, a century of African American activism has challenged the racism and social hypocrisy that allowed those responsible for Eugene Williams' death to elude justice. Such a rise in activism allowed the NAACP to gain about 100,000 members in 1919 alone. Soon, black folks were going to Congress, petitioning for anti-lynching legislation, fighting back in the courts, and filing lawsuits when people were being mistreated. However, the significance of the Red Summer was quickly lost.
Separate from the legacy in terms of how the riots actually impact the city, right? People just don't remember it, and those with power have a disproportionate responsibility to either lead or sort of try to sort of obscure, and those with power in the 1920s didn't have any incentive to try to sort of celebrate or remember this history.
Following the Red Summer, backlash was on stark display in Chicago.
There was legal, subtle, non-overtly violent ways to achieve the same ends, which is to contain African Americans to certain parts of the city. Sure enough, residential segregation was sort of then perpetuated in other ways. Instead of using gang violence, restrictive covenants and other legal tools basically prohibited black people from moving to whole parts of the city.
Only in 1940 did the Supreme Court rule that a man named Carl Hansberry couldn't be bound by a neighborhood's restrictive covenant he hadn't signed. Meanwhile, protests throughout the 1940s and 50s sought to break down racial barriers in housing, public accommodations, and recreational activities. But the legacy of racial violence also continued throughout the 1950s with the murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till in 1955. Till's family had moved to Chicago during the Great Migration, but was visiting family in Mississippi when Till was kidnapped and murdered for supposedly whistling at a white woman in a store.
If the FBI would investigate, then probably then we could integrate. Yeah! Keep your eyes on the prize.
1966, famously, Martin Luther King Jr. and his family moved into a West Side neighborhood and lived off and on for the better part of half a year to raise awareness about residential segregation in non-Southern cities in what was called the Chicago Freedom Movement.
Racial tensions and divisions were still so present in Chicago at this time that King once said, "I think the people from Mississippi ought to come to Chicago to learn how to hate." By 1970, Census Data certified Chicago as a hyper-segregated municipality, a designation it would retain until the start of the new millennium. To this day, the city of Chicago remains notoriously segregated. But in 2008, Barack Obama lived at 5046 South Greenwood Ave in Kenwood, where had it not been for the battles fought by Hansberry and others, he would have been barred under the Chicago Real Estate Board's restrictive covenant, despite recently being elected President of the United States of America.